Hello, Anton.
Hello. All right. I've got to warn you that we have some construction going on in the house. So.
Oh, okay. I've got to warn you the neighborhood dog is on the loose and being very active this morning, too.
All right.
Are you still based in Berkeley?
That's right. Yeah, I'm still in Berkeley.
Wow. Well, I'm coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada, where I'm now based.
Cool.
And so the thought was I sent a podcast out maybe a couple of weeks ago, a short one, just to say, hey, if anyone else is still in this community, please get in contact. I got one email, and for some other reason, Kyle Harrington, who's a fellow who I met at one of the A-Life conferences in 2012, also contacted me, and I asked about our mutual friend John to see what was happening with him. But yeah, so one piece of contact, and the thought at the time was I was going to try and model football hooliganism as a regional fighting style in the various parts of London. And the fellow I was corresponding with obviously was clearly turned off by that idea and didn't respond after that. So I got exactly one email, and thank you to the one email correspondent. But I did want to have the chance to chat with you today because I went back and listened to some of the old podcasts and I thought, wow, what are Anton's up to now?
Well, I was working at Google for a while, and then I'm now working at Adobe, working on 3D modeling software.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that's been cool. In fact, it's been interesting enough that it's been actually hard to divert any energy towards the A-Life projects because there's enough cool things going on at work. But I did manage to finish this artificial clock project, which I was working on, which is this Arduino-based clock that I made that sort of is based on cute little, fairly fake but interesting artificial life things in it. And so the idea there was to try and see if we can make a useful household appliance out of A-Life stuff. Because
so it looked like a regular digital, I mean, I've seen a photo of it. It looked like a regular digital clock with some kind of cellular automata simulation going on where the numbers weren't, basically.
Yeah, so the numbers themselves, the way that actually works is I tried to make it sort of as bottom-up as I could, and I only got so far. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk about like how far I got and maybe just discuss ideas about how to get farther and also just kind of the interesting things to think about there. And the idea I had was, we always do this A-Life stuff, and then like Dave Ackley has talked about, can we make real things on top of essentially cellular automata-like things? And Stephen Wolfram talked about like mining the cellular automata universe and stuff. So I thought, okay, well, what does that actually look like? Can we actually sort of make a useful object on top of A-Life-like principles? And so I thought, okay, well, it's an easy object to make. I thought, well, maybe a clock could be useful. And so I thought, what does it look like if you have like a living clock? And so the idea was basically like, can I make some kind of biological ecosystem that as a byproduct produces a clock? So in the same way that, we keep bees in a hive, and bees sort of as a byproduct of their life produce honey and wax and things, and we sort of harvest that byproduct for daily use. I thought, well, can we do that with artificial A-Life, and what can we harvest from it? And so I thought, okay, well, maybe we could harvest the notion of time, because that's useful for us, a sort of precise timepiece. So the thing that I made has a bunch of little ants running around on it, and there's also growing plants, and the ants harvest plants, and they sort of place them in the middle, and they make piles, and the piles they make happen to form the digits of the clock. And so they're doing their own little ant thing, which is stockpiling their things, but we get a clock out of it. Sort of, they're not aware of the clock in any way, but they are aware of basically little pheromone scents that I squirt into their little ecosystem, which happens to correspond to digits. So it's a bit heavy-handed in the sense that, still somewhere under there's like Wizard of Oz, something knows the time, which is the Arduino processor, and it presents the ants with this pheromone map, which they use to drive their behavior. So it's not really what I would say would be like, I forget the term, but like hard A-Life in a sense that like it's truly emerging from it. There's still an invisible hand, so to speak, to guide the ants to make the time digits. But I thought that, but it was like a start. And so then the next steps would be to try to make it closer to being bottom up. Like, can we design some kind of behavior that would actually, result in something meaningful for us as a byproduct of their own life? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, what one could do is potentially 7-segment, right? 7-segment LED, that's basically what you're modeling, is make each of the segments some kind of food byproduct or something that changes over time. I don't know if you could do it numerically, but I'm pretty sure you could. And therefore, rather than the segments being kind of squirted into action when the numerics were needed, they could just be piled in such a way where they would be eaten, decay, and then regenerate, almost like a plant, basically.
Yeah.
But that would have the kind of segment frequency, which is what you're looking for. Basically, what you're looking for is the segment frequency at something that the ants will either eat or interact with in such a way where time will progress because of the ants' interaction. You could always take it one step away and then you'd get to another problem space, which I can't quite visualize in my own head yet. But, you could keep removing the problem spaces until you get to this notion of emergence. You kind of walk backwards until you fall into emergence, basically.
Right. That's sort of what I'm trying to do is walk further and further backwards until it's blurry, like where the actual thing is coming from. And I think, we can lay out the segments, but then it's like, well, who laid out the segments, right? So like we laid it out in a sort of pleasant way. So can we, push it further down and down? And so that's kind of the artistic statement, so to speak, because I'm trying to see how far can I push it down, because, maybe it is interesting to think, like one way of thinking about it is can you at least imagine training or breeding an actual ant to behave like this in real life rather than be programmed, right? So can we, if we were to build this thing in actual meat space, would that be feasible even in theory? And so that's kind of the thing I'm playing with at the moment.
It is interesting, this notion of the frequency that you have through the segments and the perception of time. I'm reminded of the film Predator, that they have a numerical system that the predator has a countdown. It explodes at the end, basically. But that's a spoiler. That it has a countdown clock that's built into it. You see this segment, which looks like its little hand in LED space. So the segments are the artificiality of the system. It might just be interesting to create some kind of countdown space based on a plant's, a perceived plant or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of organic material that is predated upon, like, an algae or something. Now, algae are very interesting. You could potentially do it with algae and fish, and that would be a very different kind of clock. I'm mindful, certainly, of a lot of these biotic houses now that they build periodically in far-flung parts of the world, where they have a complete aquaponic system which both grows plants, maintains fish. Some of them deal with waste, although human waste is a very interesting thing to have to deal with. But, I could imagine a water clock potentially. I'm not sure, as a child, I read the, comic books as they came out, and they had these sea monkey things, which are little brine shrimp.
That's right,
I'm pretty sure you could train brine shrimp, well, not train them, but just use their feeding patterns as a way to make a clock. The squirter mechanism as being the primary way to do it seems to be the best possible way, but I'm sure there are plants that have some phased... I mean, again, here we're talking probably about months, not about minutes and seconds in a clock.
But at least in theory, you could imagine that, maybe you're not making a practical minute-to-minute clock, but, you could imagine making a practical calendar or something.
That would be fascinating, an organic calendar that had both plant and animals. I do wonder the humanity of whatever the terminology is for the animals. And you're just forcing them into... But then again, the fish that live in these organic houses seem to do okay out of the bargain.
It's a farming kind of thing, right? It's like you can have tolerable farming or intolerable farming. I mean, it's still farming, but...
What's particularly interesting is this notion of people that are woken up every morning by their pets. Like, there are already organic alarm clocks that people use quite skillfully when the pet gets hungry it'll wake the owner up, which is basically the function of an alarm clock in its rawest form.
Right.
So, it is interesting, this notion of organic alarm clocks as a means. But again, I guess the kind of spaces I'm in currently, just to give some update to where I am, is that leading into the pandemic, obviously I had a bunch of issues, which actually unfortunately became this podcast and other related things that I touched issues. And ironically, when we sold our house in San Jose, I bought a picture of the Somme that had been painted by a German artist who actually served in World War One. And in communicating with the fellow who maintained the artist's Wikipedia page, he said to me, "Oh yeah, look, this happens all the time. People are paid money, they come in, they delete articles on Wikipedia, it's just done." So the whole nature of the paid-for removal of all our stuff from Wikipedia, and unfortunately, clearly Tim Taylor and co. never really got onto the A-Life side of things. So all this stuff was happening through, but I had an underlying interest that I had this simulation, which still existed and still was remotely interesting to me. And wouldn't it be interesting to look at points in history? And there was a kind of a renaissance, at least through the pandemic, of London in the 1930s and 1940s, mainly in fiction writing, of which my wife consumed a good quantity of them. And I thought London in 1940 had roughly 8.5 million people in it. So it is quite an interesting ecosystem to simulate, so to speak. But also, there's a strange phenomena which I've noticed in my own interest in history, that basically history becomes mythology, and it becomes mythology through a variety of factors, both actively human factors and just the way, history is as an almost non-static thing. So I was quite interested in whether or not I could simulate a cityscape as large as London. And London and surrounds, we're talking about 100 miles by 100 miles, which includes the coastline. And thankfully, a friend of mine who has periodically appeared in this podcast, back when it had a name, Bob Mottram, got back in contact and actually helped me quite a great deal with the maps, which I purchased from the Library of Scotland. The Library of Scotland had about 10 maps that I use, which gave us a data set, which was just amazing. So now we have this data set. We have it in a JSON file format. We have it, obviously, historically, I'd simulated landscapes as well as part of my artificial life tinkerings. So we have all that stuff as well. And now I'm going back to the actual agent-based modeling part of the problem, which is you have a huge area that is defined, thankfully, in maps and other data. And then you have the problem of just simulating it for a period of time. Now, 1940 is a particularly interesting date as well, because also if things had happened in the Second World War differently, the Germans might have set foot on, certainly on England and through parts of London through that period of time. And the quality and information of simulation and just sheer information is fundamentally naive. It was played as war games through the 1960s by the military to get a sense of, it was called, the possibility that Germany would invade was called Sea Lion, Operation Sea Lion, which is what Hitler and his folks named it. And it's actually quite an interesting simulation problem as well, because you have a functioning city of 8.5 million, of whom a good number were actually being trained to be, basically a paramilitary or a guerrilla-like organization if England was invaded. So through the pandemic, I gathered together a series of books. You can actually buy classified documents now about how the Home Guard formed, and I have a booklet of the entire Home Guard for southeast of England, for the area that I'm looking to simulate. So, and the training manuals are available, or actually people that scan them into PDF now, which makes it a little bit easier, but I own the original paper ones from 1940 as well. And even mysteriously, you can get the Luftwaffe stuff. You can get all the maps the Luftwaffe used, and obviously the Luftwaffe was engaged in the Battle of Britain at the time, so they were actively bombing England. And you can get all the recruiting stuff, and it's actually quite amazing the amount of documentation you can actually get about this once you have some kind of lingering interest
once you know where to look.
Simulating agents. Well, ironically, the folks that got me the picture of the SOM were helpful with some things. But no, all this stuff is paper. There's very little of it. There are people that are, and I'm supporting the people that are actively scanning a lot of this documentation in. And obviously you have things like the London bombing maps, which unfortunately are very difficult to verify these days. And actually, if you go to every town in England has a historical society, or had a historical society, at least through the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 1990s. And they wrote long treaties, but they can't tell you exactly when specific churches were bombed, for example, or even that they were Catholic churches and not churches of England and things like this. So the whole history of the Second World War is moving into this area of mythology in actual stuff. And I think it's interesting to write simulations around that now, because you can come back and analyze the data in a very different way. So I've been kind of dabbling both in my simulation interest, my computational interest, and ironically, although the state of the art, so to speak, is really difficult to access online currently, it's not just what's happened with Wikipedia, Google as well. It's very difficult to get in contact with people that are doing meaningful analysis and simulation work in these areas currently. I do periodically get, a PDF here occasionally of, for example, archaeologists that are using simulation now and agent modeling.
Oh,
and
interesting.
so, there are fascinating people doing very interesting work out there, but it's really hard to get access to their work currently. And so I've been in this, every day is a different thing, right, in terms of bugs and tracking. And very amazingly, in the past year and a little bit, I've had 2 daughters, which has changed my life inextricably. So I'm also, doing the full fatherhood thing where possible, while basically still working in the same salt mine. And but the simulation work is very, very interesting, because you get to a kind of agent modeling, which obviously other folk are doing currently, because the archaeologists are trying to do it currently. And it's interesting talking with folks like Roy Plotnick. I reached out to Roy when I found the archaeologist doing agent modeling, and he hasn't really done much agent modeling for his stuff in the past 10 odd years. So, a lot of the historical folk are, not really continuing with it. But it is fascinating looking at principles of, JSON robustness over parsing, over multiple maps, over, you just throw it to this data and you still need a means to visualize it, which I've got, thankfully. It's like I have all the pieces for the puzzle. I just need to put the puzzle together, basically.
Yeah, it's always interesting how hard it is to find the right stuff.
Well, I just don't think you can see it. I go back to first principles and just say it probably doesn't exist. Let's roll up our sleeves and redo it. And I'm very thankful for all the stuff that I've done to date and all the folks that have helped me with the stuff that I've done to date. And this podcast series is part of that as well. But realistically, for example, football hooliganism, let's talk about the element that I'm going to be using. There was actually simulation done of football hooliganism in the 2000s, up to the 2000s. It became a phenomenon which obviously the police cracked down on it. You can buy half a dozen self-published works of former football hooligans talking about their lives, but there's no discussion associated with firstly, the historical evolution of hooliganism in England, but it exists all over the world. The current, let's say nonsense that's going on, many of the discussive forces originated as football hooligans, funnily enough. So it's very strange particularly the Ukrainian football hooligan, origins are fascinating. So I think, there are gaps basically both in the literature and the simulation associated with this, and certainly associated with agent modeling around that, although the stuff that was done in 2000 that I can see at least made one video game. So, that's basically
Which game was that at?
I think it's called Football. Actually,
oh my God.
They did do half a dozen other really curious. They did a repaired, bombed out Europe after the Second World War, which was a fascinating simulation. They did do a series of simulations in their repertoire. But yeah, I bought the book that was supposed to contain the published data that they had. And unfortunately, I bought a later edition, and that whole chapter had been removed. So, the usual problems kind of came into play. And also, just talking with people in England, they were just like, no, you have anything to do with football hooliganism, this whole project will stink. We're not going to have anything to do with it. It's like, okay, I'm just not going to write it. I mean, the social nature of what football hooliganism did. I mean, I lived in England through that period of time. I was pushed off trains periodically by police and filmed because I just mysteriously went on a day with my wife using the same train system that Manchester United fans were using. So, I mean, I experienced basically the end of football hooliganism as it was created in England. But yeah, it is very curious now that, and obviously this one correspondent who may or might have been listening to this podcast was, but it does beg a serious question about actually the nature of simulating history. The next historical period that I would love to dig into more, mainly because through another podcast I've done, I've had primary access to a fellow who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And the whole history of Vietnam is more than mythology now. This is the Vietnam War specifically. It's actually completely redacted and piecemeal. The best histories you can get of Vietnam are from 1975. Afterwards, the US military primarily came in and just changed the whole nature of what the history of Vietnam was. And there are institutes which are, publishing their own histories of Vietnam. But let's take this back to A-Life. My interest, well, not even, I wouldn't call it A-Life, I'd call it agent modeling. But my interest is in simulating a population through, like, normal times, and then simulating the population through perturbed times, and see what can actually come out of the simulation with the view that you're dealing with, like I say, probably 8.5 million agents initially, plus whatever number your imaginary dictator throws on the battlefield. And it's a very topical and unique simulation, I think. And certainly I've gotten a lot of really interesting feedback. It's one of these things where when I started developing my early simulations with the apes on the islands, I got maybe half a dozen interested academics, and I told a variety of folk about this, and London in the 1940s is a particular intersection in terms of people's thinking, and creating any meaningful information about this. I know a fellow, for example, who does YouTube's wandering around London currently, and constantly films areas of where, there are historically have been bombed out buildings, and no longer they've rebuilt, and the histories that he is given associated with are very mythological. They're not what you would consider to be history anymore. And it's interesting, the role of simulation almost as not necessarily a reinforcement, but a means of testing hypotheses more than anything.
Right.
So anyway, that's my day-to-day. Literally, it's just regular memory leaks, bug fixes, crashes, and it's software engineering fundamentally, but it is genuinely fascinating to get to a point where you're like, okay, well, I've put a video online, for example, of the map set. The map set's not brilliant. It still needs a lot of manual editing. I'm writing a manual editor as well to go through the JSON and make sure the buildings actually look like buildings. And the internals of them, obviously, we don't know. So thankfully, historically, I've simulated the internals of buildings based on just the spaces. But that's based on contemporary buildings. It's not based on English architecture of the 1940s, of which I now have a couple of books on, and I think are probably just a tweak of those rules, basically. So, these are the things that are... but also, part of doing this stuff is actually getting other folks involved and interested. And thankfully, Bob Mottram came back. He came back for a period of time, but he's got particular interests, which are mainly about creating the next open source Twitter and not associated with this kind of simulation. Right. So the aim is, are there people that are interested in the data set? Because it's an amazing data set. I mean, London in 1940 to, a building base where you can literally open doors and walk into buildings. I would have thought it had some interest to someone, but it's just, you don't have traditional Google, you don't have traditional Wikipedia, you don't have traditional means to put these things out there. You're just basically working on your own particular websites, doing your own particular data analysis. And thankfully, I've got things like this, which occasionally reach a few folks. So,
yeah, I think it's really interesting. Any kind of simulation is sort of fascinating to me personally. But I Googled the games you were talking about. it's pretty hilarious that someone's actually made a game around it. It's pretty fun to watch.
I think it's more a story, which is the book that is published. The book that has published it is really how people that do this kind of stuff academically need to be very, let's say, neurodiverse, for want of a better term, in order to get funding for their work. I mean, really what they're talking, or what is apparently, allegedly the chapter was about, because I never actually got to read it, but it's in a narrative associated with academics that sell their work to Microsoft, for example, or academics that sell their work to EA and get games made out of it, which I think is actually probably quite interesting, and historically at least has been topical for this podcast. So it's very much of, like, you know, academics that have been tinkering away. They're looking to maintain funding for however many years, so they sell the rights of their simulations to a video games company, and there's a list of them. There's a dozen or so that they list in the book as being the way of the future. And I think large scale environment games are just absolutely fascinating. I mean, most of them, unfortunately, are based on military simulation, which is another part of this. But the essence of creating interesting simulations and then selling those simulations to buyers was certainly a curious narrative in 2005. I don't know where it exists now. I mean, I don't think either of us have worked for the company formerly known as Meta, or maybe currently known as Meta. But, right, you know, they're talking very much about creating these size universes with, I guess, simulated entities. But every time a Meta recruiter reaches out to me, I say to them, hey, I got this project where I'm simulating London in 1940. Wouldn't this be of interest to you? And crickets, you know. So, you know, it's an interesting principle that these simulations, particularly at scale, would have an interest outside of, you know, traditional academia and actually be used in industry accordingly. But I don't know if you've kind of had a life experience in the games industry, and I'm very pleased that you're enjoying Adobe as much as you are.
Yeah, no, I think games are a lot of the stuff that we do in games we're actually doing now, because the app we're working on is you know, modeling, and it's also works in VR, and so it needs to be real time, and so we're writing it in a very game-like fashion, actually, compared to a sort of traditional editing application. So a lot of that stuff is very applicable. But yeah, just being able to deal with large quantities of data is actually quite useful. You know, whether the other thing that you know, the other modeling thing that I worked on at Sony, the Dreams game, we actually had some random research projects where we used agent simulation to do procedural effects on the sculpting surface, like put little creatures on it and have them sort of like add texture to the sculpts and things of that nature. So that stuff shows up all over the place, I think. So it's always surprisingly useful. I'm sure agent simulations for war have been done a lot, right? I mean, at least I would imagine they'd be done, you know, as part of war games for the government or whatever. I guess that stuff's probably pretty secret, but it's a bit surprising to hear that people haven't done essentially more of it. Just even in academia, it seems like, since they do it for the stock market, you would think that they would do it for military conflicts and things.
Well, yes, you have the problem of secrecy. You have the problem also, I didn't even really dabble while I was in Australia. Part of my Australian escape was working for, well, they called themselves a VR lab, but they were always courting military and aerospace and a bunch of... but the thing that struck me about that was just the immense amount of financial weight. Like, literally, working with NASA briefly, they had an office that was like a school building, you know, had individual rooms and what have you. And you'd go into, you know, a floor, like the second floor, and every room would be filled with Sun workstations, like literally floor-to-ceiling Sun workstations in boxes. And you just think, this is their fight. Like, they need to have a financial, you know, year over year, we need this number of billion for, and all we can do is, and when I talked to them, actually, they were doing a Mars rover. I mean, obviously, historically, this podcast was associated with that kind of stuff as well. And, none of it was open source, and none of it was interactive. And like, you could have actually solved like a majority of your problems by now if you'd actually released it open source. And, there were 15-year-old kids that had downloaded it. In fact, the irony was that it was, when I was doing it, this will put a time frame on it as well, was about when they released the iMac years ago. Like, we're talking 2000s, late 90s even. And, OpenGL on the iMac gave you basically the same amount of power that you had in one of these Sun extension machines, except for obviously a fourth or an eighth of the price. But yeah, my recollection associated with these things is it's just about maintaining a spending. Like, the technology is completely tertiary. They'll have a demo of what they want. But yeah, the whole nature of more, integrated collaboration, all the open source stuff that I've historically liked. But yeah, around large data sets is actually really fascinating. And that's my hope, that this is just a field of interest that is being cultivated somewhere. I do periodically, read that certain universities have certain interests. There was one posted, actually, literally, that came in this morning, where half the requirements for the master's and PhD students were, 5-letter acronyms associated with additions, Python library additions and things like that. So, I mean, my sense is it's probably being done somewhere, but the difficulty in actually obtaining that, and it's far more fun, actually, to work a lot of this stuff from the ground up. And I think that's still a kind of lingering problem that, certainly when Bob Mottram gets involved, he's got his own suite of algorithms for map analysis that he can dig into and just produce output. And then I've got my additional algorithms that I like. And we're just, we're hybridizing based on our own collective knowledge. I do wonder for folks starting out. I mean, there's a lot, as probably your experience associated with the reinvention of the wheel continuously. But I've always tried to put my stuff at least downloadable and tinkerable. Whether or not people can access it is a different thing. But yeah, as a field, it seems that we've become considerably more fractured. I know there are academics that have historically published great stuff, particularly in terms of collective works. But that the availability of that quickly online or easily accessible just doesn't seem to be there. Reddit is an interesting... I think you were talking to me about Reddit when we last spoke many years ago, a couple of years ago now. I mean, I'm finding Reddit a very interesting way that this thing could potentially explode. There's a lot of what I think historically we talked about as peacocking on Reddit, but I think the potential for them to, make it into the next Wikipedia is hopeful if they have a few folk involved. But.
It's always hard when it's one platform because, there's always tensions around finding stuff or having stuff that other people don't like. And so I think it's always healthy to have multiple places.
Yeah, it would be nice, wouldn't it?
But yeah, it's the online social thing is tricky. And the information finding thing is tricky because, like you said, it's like even if the stuff is out there and it's great, finding it is often like either impossible or just like harder than actually rewriting it. Like you basically have to start rewriting it to some extent just to build up the vocabulary of what it is even that you're searching for. And then once you're like halfway in it, you're like, well, might as well just use my thing at this point because I'm already sort of, I get it, right? And I think that's how they proliferate. It's like you don't really know what you need until you build it, at least partially, or at least understand why people are doing things the way they're doing it. So I don't know. I think that seems pretty fundamental. I don't know how we get over that as an engineering discipline because that seems really hard.
Yeah, it seems completely counterintuitive, which is why I put the audio out, that I think it really is a very strange thing that we're coming into and probably something that we couldn't have even predicted. I mean, the benefits of gathering as much as you could and learning as much as you could and doing as much as you could in a very, particular time seems now quite secondary. In parallel to this, I should also point out with regards to the C-line development, I am writing as well with the hope that a portion of it will be put online free to download. A portion might end up in some kind of toxic book form, but the actual documentation of this and going through the process, even the somewhat amusing tales of football hooliganism, I think probably is benefit in actually documenting in some fashion. I mean, a portion of it will exist online, a portion of it will exist in, PDF downloadable portion will exist, like I say, maybe even in paper form. But I found it very important documenting, and certainly my early simulation I documented relatively heavily as well. I think it's really, I don't even understand how Google works anymore. My suspicion is that it has a series of rules, a series of paid-for components, and then you get out what kind of slurry is left at the end. But the idea of actually putting it online in writing at least means that it's discoverable, hopefully, by a small number of like-minded folks. I'm not sure what your other hobbies are, but I find in other hobbies, there are these people that are just constantly trying to gather information. And you occasionally meet them, and you occasionally download the information they have and upload the information that you have given to them, and you feel like you buoyed yourselves in some sense. And I think this is probably what's going to happen with this kind of information. I mean, it's interesting, the universities that are teaching aspects of this and what aspects they're missing. And actually, a lot of the history is being missed in, for just teaching the stuff like you would learn Python, for example, or, some other programming language, you would learn this. But the history behind it is oftentimes how elaborate and also how broken certain aspects of it are. I think, in particular, the teaching associated with neural networks and how to use them and how to adapt them and this kind of stuff is really very interesting. I'm not sure if you follow any of that, but it kind of works in parallel to a lot of what you would describe as A-Life, what I would describe as a series of different things, basically.
Yeah, it's definitely the hot thing. I followed it a bit when I worked at Google, and I do a little bit follow it for work now, but not a ton. But yeah, there's definitely lots of different aspects to it, and there's, like you said, a huge, there's obviously like the theoretical body of knowledge around it, and then there's like the very engineering body of knowledge around how to duct tape these frameworks together to get this thing to run on this cloud or that cloud.
Contemporary computing has made it, it's completely, in the 80s I used to run simulations associated with neural networks that were in really slow, you'd see it evolve, literally you'd leave it for an hour or two and you'd come back and you'd see what, you needed to see from that. And in a cell phone now, you have more processing power than you ever had there, and hence facial recognition works and these kind of things work. Part of it is obviously the algorithms behind it and the development of the algorithms. Part of it is just raw processing. And that's what I'm actually finding fascinating with the C-line stuff, is that I can do things now which I never would have ever considered doing, 20 years ago, just because of the processing, and things that are like n-squared problems where I'm like, this is an n-squared problem. There's no point in, moving forward with this. And then like, okay, let me run. Okay, it's nothing. Like even in the cloud, emulating it's nothing. So the nature of contemporary processing really changes the game very distinctly. And I think that's how you get innovation. I mean, clearly there's a lot of algorithmic change, and clearly there's a whole bunch of breakthroughs in computation and what have you. But it's just amazing, as you say, in the cloud and these kind of, you can get stuff you'd never even imagine. You'd write code now, which you'd never imagine writing 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and you almost need like a new generation of people to write it, because, some of the stuff that gets thrown around is like so horribly inefficient, and yet it's still the right thing to do. But I find it hard to sometimes like bring myself to even write that kind of code, because it's just so abusive to the computer.
Well, you want to do smart things. I mean, we probably were both, raised, taught, whatever, grabbed together what we needed through a period of time where you needed to find a better way. You always had to find a smarter way of doing something because of the processing that you had access to. But yeah, it's interesting, the new problem space. I think there are different methodologies which people have adopted. And yes, new people is always good, but new people that understand some aspect of the history is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, I think it's almost akin to like money management in a way. It's like if you grow up and you don't have a lot of money, you try to like be very careful with it and stuff like that. And then, but after a certain point, that level of detail like can't be sustained. If you're like the CEO of a company or something, you can't be going around, the floor and making sure that no M&Ms are wasted in your kitchens at the giant corporate office, right? Like you just don't have the time in your day to sort of micromanage every bit of financial stuff. And I think that's partly what's sort of happening with these computing resources. Like people have gotten so compute rich that it just doesn't make any sense to sort of care that much. Like you can't if you want to accomplish these bigger things. So I think that, that's the more, how should I put it? Like, I guess that's the positive way I could imagine it, as opposed to just being like, oh, this is just insanely wasteful and people should just be better engineers. But like, I think it's just a reality of when you have this vast amount of resources, you simply can't really, you start to think about different problems, right? You're talking about like investing, $1 billion in this company versus like, making sure you get the cheap beans versus the expensive beans. You sort of transcended to a different level of optimization, right? You're not talking about dollars anymore. You're talking about billions of dollars. And so you do have to start to change your mental model of what's important kind of quite fundamentally and spend your energy on different things. And, so maybe it's partly that as well, because if you're working in these data centers and like, it's fine to sort of spin up 10,000 machines just to like add a couple of numbers that you could do on your laptop, but like whatever, just, I've already got this tool, like might as well just use it because that's where my head's at.
This comes into machine learning too, but the ability of non-real-time computation versus real-time computation, like if you do extra processing in a non-real-time space, then when you present the data in the real-time space, the processing is less, for want of a better term. And I think this certainly hit me with the C-line stuff, is that it's when we get the larger data sets, you do particular crunching, particular optimization to make sure that when the data is presented to the agents, for example, then you have a data set which is absolutely exactly what they need at that specific time. And basically you've done as much heavy lifting as you can in the parsing and the polishing of the data and present it accordingly. And I think these are principles which obviously are independent of the stuff that historically we've talked about in these kind of podcasts, but the environment, creating an environment, a rich environment for these agent entities to interact and exist in and be observed in. Now you have the luxury of how you actually create that data and the information that the data contains. And when you have large data sets, obviously how you parse that data and how you get the data out to the agent as quickly as possible. So yeah, the distinction between doing a lot of heavy lifting initially, so you don't have to do any heavy lifting in the real-time component that people observe, is certainly something that I'm getting out of the C-line development quite heavily.
So are you running your thing like up in the cloud somewhere, or are you doing it locally?
I'm using GitLab heavily because I haven't historically used GitHub, and thankfully it still maintains Bob Mottram occasionally. So most of it is getting one data set, processing the data set into a JSON format, which is best accessible to the agents. And the JSON format has changed maybe half a dozen times, and also obviously maintaining, because you're dealing with maps of the 1940, literally PNG files of maps of the 1940s. So, you change some aspect of the algorithm, particularly with regards to coastlines or sand distribution or however you're modeling that, and then mysteriously the JSON breaks somewhere in this, 8 to 10 gig JSON file. So, I'm using a combination of factors. In fact, GitLab makes it very easy to distribute this kind of stuff in the pre-processing to get the data ready. And then the agent models can obviously also be run in the cloud as well, just in terms of testing. So I'm doing increasingly a majority of the heavy lifting in the cloud, and just literally visualization, basic analysis, and, hypothesis more than anything. And occasionally you'll get crashes that you have to look into that require you to actually run it locally, but everything can run locally through scripts too, although it's not particularly fun. So, I'm doing a lot more, as the vernacular says, in the cloud now than I ever would have historically done. But also the nature of the data sets are just huge. And the processing time. So, for example, if I do it on my laptop, if I process all of the area 100 miles by 100 miles, it takes typically 14 hours worth of processing. So I can do that, and I have done that on a couple of occasions to get the data set exactly the way I want it. but it's far easier to make coding changes in the JSON and then set it up on. Thankfully, GitLab allows me for a certain number of gigabytes, in all possible directions, and then thankfully I can download the created PNG files that come from this and then just analyze those. So I've changed the way I do A-Life quite fundamentally, and this is still using the same Ape SDK that I've been using for, 30 years now. So it is really quite striking how my flow, for want of a better term, has changed. But also a lot of that, so when you're working in open source with another developer, they can do whatever they like and frequently do. And actually part of the interesting learning comes from that. So a good portion of the code that exists is to test the dataset and to make sure that the dataset is still robust and there aren't squirrely things like, no beaches in a particular map. So that creates a bunch of unnecessary JSON and stuff like that. So it's, more in the cloud than I'd historically done, but still the aim is to have something which is like an app, basically, that's runnable and enables you to interact with the environment as presented. But you're dealing with relatively large JSON output. You're dealing with a relatively large data set. And also it's a data set that, as is independently rendered, has problems within it that still need manual editing after the fact. And the manual editor I have on my machine, but also similarly maintain it in the cloud, maintain it command line, maintain it so I can get PNG files out whenever I want them of, what the latest and greatest maps look like.
So what do you do when you process these maps? Is like image processing kind of stuff that you're trying to do on them?
So Bob has a suite of things which he does associated with, there's a bit of nearest neighbor calculation, there's a bit of Gaussian blurring, there's a bunch of stuff that he uses for the analysis. I had kind of basic color analysis, which still had a relative spectrum in it associated with the maps, but he has a whole suite which you can have a look at, which does a variety of things for analyzing the maps and then creating the JSON output. There are problems with it. I mean, the creation of buildings is still pretty haphazard from my view. There's nothing like a manual edit over the top of what he puts out. But yeah, it's a combination of factors to make the JSON, and he has multiple layer processing as well. So, for example, he'll do maps with one algorithm and then take the maps, there are about, like I said, 10 or so maps, and then do additional processing on the map JSON output to get additional JSON output. So he's got various layers of processing that he uses with the maps as well. And yeah, it's quite, literally I was getting burnt out with this project early on in COVID, and Bob came through and just, redid everything that I was getting annoyed with, and now has left me a data set. Which has its own problems as well. I mean, it's very interesting, just the, many different permutations of JSON data, basically. But yeah, so that's it.
And what's your kind of goal in mind? Other than just...
So historically, I had an urban simulation, which ironically was based on a terrorist simulation that I wrote in 1997. And that created basically noble apes wandering over an urban cityscape, and, opening doors and moving around. And the idea through that was that they would each get a house and have a profession and, start behaving based on their professions. And you'd have things like shopping centers and stuff like that, and just basically taking an organic environment and making it into a cityscape and using a lot of the same analysis that you used in the organic environment to create agents in a cityscape. So you may or may not have seen that in videos or downloaded or whatever. But that still exists. I still maintain that. I mean, that's actually, when I can't get London to look the way I want to look, I go back to the algorithmically created maps of cities that I have built historically, because they give you, walls and doors and windows and things like that. So the aim is to have London, probably based on the PNG maps. The PNG with the overlay of the agent models is actually incredibly compelling, because you can see, the buildings and the walls and the trains and these kind of things as overlays on top of the map.
That's cool. I'd love to see some videos.
I need to start getting that stuff on more, like, videoing. The difficulty is the nature of kind of small deltas, as in bug fixes and, oh no, this data set that comes to me in points that I convert into lines crashes eccentrically in this particular position, which is just the nature of the day-to-day. And then also the map editing is also interesting because you've got an environment that you have to move around. But yeah, I need to record some video of me just scrolling around one of these maps with stuff on it and get a sense of that. I have historically every couple of months recorded YouTube on this, and it's interesting. I get periodic likes and interest through that, but I just would love to get more people interested in the project through that. But yeah, I'm overdue a video. I wanted to get the map editing to a point where I could at least show it. There's eccentricities with the file handling and things like that, which, but yeah, just to show it, because it's actually quite cool to see the overlay over the map of the environment and then also talk about the agent models.
I haven't seen anything like that. I think that would be pretty unique and
it's visually compelling. Yeah, it's visually compelling, but, you create a YouTube video, it goes out in the ether and, time goes on and occasionally you get the likes of Bob Mottram, but not always. But yeah, I'm at the stage where I just need to get the map editor. The map editor is actually fun to use. I mean, I've used a lot of the Mac image editing packages. Of course, your current company is responsible for one of them. But yeah, the butteriness, as they say in the industry, of moving around these images, which are huge data sets, just like you're just moving your fingers across them. That would make compelling video. I need to get that out. But there's always that one bug. That's sort of the nature of these things, unfortunately. You just
can cut the video together. It's all right.
I'm not, I don't know. I'm too honest. That's always been my problem in these circumstances.
Yeah, you can't be too honest when you make videos.
Yeah, I should get all,
as long as the message is honest, I think you're fine. I think,
it's a slippery slope as far as I'm concerned. In any case, yeah, I'm overdue a video by a couple of months, so I need to get one together. At least just show the movement around the data set and the editing of it. But yeah, so the idea is that you have simulated agents over the top of the data set that'll move around. It's basically London in 1940 with a very slight chance of invasion. So the invasion part of it really is incredibly secondary, but also just has been a fascinating reading, if nothing more. Just to show there's a lot of really interesting reading through this, particularly associated with how, it has very similar to football hooliganism, it has a very striking response to a lot of people. I mean, I personally, on both my mother's and father's side of the family, have Second World War related deaths and other things. So it is still very much in people's minds. But the simulation aspect of it and just getting the data looking right is aesthetically, and certainly probably a majority of the folks that keep in contact with me about it are interested in that. So I'm owed to get out a video. I need to get out a video without question.
Well, I'm looking forward to that.
So I still have about half an hour, and I'm not sure what you're up to. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I've actually probably got to get back to the kids soon, but it's been super cool catching up.
Definitely. We need to do it more frequently. I think 2 years and 3 months is probably a little bit too long.
Yeah, well, hopefully I'll have something interesting to show. Maybe I'll pick up on the clock thing and
definitely
have a new one to show next time.
Yeah, maybe with plants and fish.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I'll talk to you soon, Anton.
Take care. Yeah, pleasure.